The whispers followed Tabitha Turner through the dusty streets of Silver Creek like a shadow she couldn't outrun. "Plain as prairie dust," they said, not bothering to lower their voices as she passed the general store with her basket of mending. It was 1875, and in a frontier town where eligible women were as scarce as rainfall, Tabitha had somehow remained unwed at 22, a fact that provided endless fodder for town gossip. Tabitha kept her eyes fixed ahead as she navigated the rutted Main Street. The morning sun beat down on her simple blue calico dress, the same one she'd worn every Tuesday for the past year. Her brown hair was pulled back in a practical bun, not a single curl framing her face like the Gibson girl illustrations that had begun appearing in the Eastern papers. She had no rouge for her cheeks, no ribbons for adornment. What she did have were capable hands, a sharp mind, and a heart that she'd learned to guard carefully. "Good morning, Miss Turner," called Mr. Jameson from the post office steps. His greeting was kind enough, but Tabitha had seen the pitying looks he exchanged with his wife whenever she entered their establishment. "Morning, Mr. Jameson," she replied, offering a polite nod before continuing toward Mrs. Wilson's boarding house, where she worked as a seamstress and occasional cook. The widow Wilson was one of the few people in town who treated Tabitha with genuine warmth, though even she had taken to dropping hints about making an effort with her appearance. The boarding house loomed ahead, a two-story clapboard structure that housed mainly railroad workers and the occasional traveler passing through. As Tabitha approached, she noticed an unfamiliar horse tied to the hitching post, a magnificent chestnut stallion with a white blaze down its face. The animal stood at least 16 hands high, its coat gleaming in the morning light. Whoever owned such a horse wasn't just passing through, they had means. Tabitha entered through the kitchen door as usual, finding Mrs. Wilson fussing over a pot of coffee with more care than the morning batch typically warranted. "Oh, Tabitha, there you are." The older woman's face was flushed with excitement. "We've got a new boarder, just arrived from Texas. A cattleman, and quite the gentleman, too." "I saw the horse," Tabitha replied, setting her basket on the work table. "It's a fine animal." "The man's finer," Mrs. Wilson whispered with a wink. "And single, from what I gathered. Name's Logan Quinn. He's taking breakfast in the dining room now." Tabitha merely nodded, accustomed to Mrs. Wilson's attempts at matchmaking. She'd long ago accepted that marriage wasn't in her future, not in a place like Silver Creek, where men sought wives who were either beautiful or wealthy, preferably both. She was neither. "He'll be staying through the winter at least," Mrs. Wilson continued. "Something about buying breeding stock come spring. I put him in the corner room upstairs. It needs new curtains, something terrible." "I can start on those today," Tabitha offered, already mentally measuring the windows in that room. "That would be lovely, dear. But first, would you mind taking in some more coffee? I'm still getting the biscuits out of the oven." Tabitha hesitated, then nodded. She filled a fresh pot and carried it toward the dining room, steeling herself for the inevitable awkward encounter. New arrivals always looked at her with that momentary glimmer of interest that quickly faded to polite indifference once they'd taken her full measure. The dining room was empty save for one man seated with his back to the door. Even sitting, Tabitha could tell he was tall. Broad shoulders strained against a clean blue shirt, and his dark hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, too long for city fashion but not unkempt. "More coffee, sir?" she asked, keeping her voice even. Logan Quinn turned, and Tabitha nearly fumbled the coffee pot. His eyes were the color of a summer storm gray with hints of blue, and they crinkled slightly at the corners as he smiled. His face was tanned from the sun, with a strong jaw shadowed by a day's growth of beard. He wasn't handsome in the conventional way of the dandies who occasionally passed through town, but there was something compelling about his features. "That would be mighty welcome, miss," he said, his voice carrying a slight Texas drawl. "Been riding since before dawn." Tabitha poured the coffee with steady hands, though she felt his gaze on her face. Here it comes, she thought. The moment of assessment followed by dismissal. "Thank you kindly," he said when she'd finished. "Might I know your name?" "Tabitha Turner, sir. I work for Mrs. Wilson." "Logan Quinn." He extended a hand, an unusual gesture toward a serving woman. After a moment's hesitation, Tabitha shifted the coffee pot to her left hand and briefly clasped his outstretched palm. His hand was warm and calloused, engulfing her smaller one. "A pleasure to meet you, Miss Turner," he said, and something in his tone made her look up sharply. There was no trace of the expected dismissal in his eyes, only warm interest. "Will you be joining us for dinner later?" he asked. "Mrs. Wilson speaks highly of your cooking." "I help with the meals when needed," Tabitha replied carefully, "but I'm primarily employed as a seamstress." "A useful skill out here," Logan nodded appreciatively. "I've got a shirt that's seen better days after the trail. Would you have time to mend it? Of course. Just leave it with Mrs. Wilson." A loud crash from the kitchen saved Tabitha from further conversation. She excused herself quickly, heart beating unnaturally fast as she retreated to help Mrs. Wilson with whatever disaster had occurred. The rest of the morning passed in a flurry of activity. Mrs. Wilson had indeed dropped an entire tray of biscuits, necessitating a new batch. By the time the kitchen was restored to order, Logan Quinn had departed for town to attend to his business. Tabitha found herself oddly disappointed, then immediately chastised herself for the feeling. Men like Logan Quinn didn't look twice at women like her, regardless of how civil their first meeting had been. She spent the afternoon measuring and cutting fabric for the new curtains, working near the window to take advantage of the natural light. The rhythmic movement of needle through cloth always calmed her, allowing her mind to wander. Today, however, her thoughts kept returning to storm gray eyes and a smile that reached them. "Foolishness," she muttered to herself, pricking her finger in her distraction. A drop of blood welled up, and she pressed it to her apron before it could stain the fabric. The day wore on, and Tabitha completed the first curtain panel before helping prepare the evening meal. The boarding house currently hosted 5 residents besides Logan Quinn, 2 railroad surveyors, a land speculator, and an elderly couple waiting for their new home to be completed on the edge of town. All would be present for dinner, which meant extra work in the kitchen. By the time the food was ready to be served, Tabitha had nearly convinced herself that her strange reaction to the Texan had been nothing more than surprise at meeting someone new. She smoothed her hands over her apron, tucked a stray hair back into her bun, and carried the tureen of beef stew to the dining room. The boarders were already seated, conversation flowing easily among them. Logan Quinn sat at the far end of the table, and though he was engaged in discussion with one of the railroad men, his eyes immediately found Tabitha as she entered. He offered a slight nod of acknowledgement that sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. The meal progressed without incident. Tabitha moved efficiently between kitchen and dining room, refilling plates and glasses as needed. She noticed that Logan ate heartily but neatly, and that he thanked her each time she served him, unlike some of the other men who barely seemed to register her presence. As she cleared the dessert plates, the land speculator, Mr. Hargrove, caught her arm. "Another piece of pie, girl," he said, not bothering to look up at her, "and be quick about it." Tabitha nodded silently, accustomed to such treatment. She was turning toward the kitchen when Logan's voice cut through the room. "The lady's name is Miss Turner, Hargrove," he said quietly, and a please wouldn't go amiss. The table fell silent. Mr. Hargrove's face reddened, whether from embarrassment or anger, Tabitha couldn't tell. For her part, she stood frozen, the stack of plates in her hands suddenly seeming too heavy to carry. "No offense meant," Hargrove finally mumbled. "May I please have another slice of pie, Miss Turner?" "Of course, sir," Tabitha managed, her voice surprisingly steady. She glanced at Logan, who was watching her with an expression she couldn't decipher. She hurried to the kitchen, heart hammering in her chest. Mrs. Wilson was waiting, eyes wide with curiosity. What happened in there? Everyone went quiet as a church mouse. "Mr. Quinn corrected Mr. Hargrove for being impolite to me," Tabitha explained, setting down the dishes and cutting another slice of apple pie. Mrs. Wilson's eyebrows shot up. "Did he now? Well, well, seems our Texan has manners to match that fine horse of his." She patted Tabitha's shoulder. "Best get that pie out there before Hargrove turns any redder." The remainder of the evening passed without further incident. Tabitha completed her duties and retreated to her small room at the back of the house, a space barely large enough for a narrow bed, and a trunk containing her few possessions. As she prepared for bed, she found herself replaying Logan's intervention at dinner. No one had ever spoken up for her like that before, certainly no man had. "Don't be silly," she told her reflection in the small mirror as she braided her hair for the night. "He would have done the same for any woman. It means nothing." But as she blew out her candle and settled under the thin quilt, Tabitha couldn't quite suppress the hope that perhaps it meant something after all. The next morning dawned clear and cold, a reminder that winter was fast approaching. Tabitha rose early, as was her habit, and helped Mrs. Wilson prepare breakfast for the boarders. She was kneading dough for the day's bread when heavy footsteps sounded on the back porch, followed by a knock at the kitchen door. Mrs. Wilson answered it, exclaiming in surprise, "Mr. Quinn." "We didn't expect you up and about so early." "Been up since 5, madam," came the now familiar voice. "Thought I might trouble you for some coffee before I head out to the Patterson Ranch." Of course, coming out of that chill." Mrs. Wilson ushered him into the warmth of the kitchen. "Tabitha's just starting the bread, but the coffee's hot." Tabitha kept her eyes on her work, aware of Logan's presence like a physical force in the small room. She heard the scrape of a chair as he sat at the kitchen table. "Morning, Miss Turner," he said, and she had no choice but to look up. "Good morning, Mr. Quinn," she replied, trying to ignore the flour dusting her hands and apron. His hair was damp, as if he'd just washed, and he wore a clean flannel shirt under a worn leather vest. The effect was undeniably appealing. "That's quite a skill," he commented, nodding toward the dough she was working. "My mother made bread every morning of my childhood, but I never did get the hang of watching how she did it." "It just takes practice," Tabitha said, surprised into a more natural response. "And patience." "Two things I'm trying to cultivate more of," he said with a smile that transformed his face, softening the hard lines. "Though I admit, patience has never been my strong suit." Mrs. Wilson set a steaming cup of coffee before him. "Are you looking to buy stock from old Patterson, then?" "Hoping to, yes. He's got some Hereford bulls I'm interested in, looking to improve my herd back in Texas." He took a sip of coffee. "This is fine coffee, Mrs. Wilson, thank you." "Oh, it's Tabitha you should thank. She's the one who insists on grinding the beans fresh each morning, though it takes extra time." Logan's eyes found Tabitha's again. "Then I'm in your debt, Miss Turner. Good coffee's a rare thing on the frontier." Tabitha felt heat rise to her cheeks. "It's nothing special." "I disagree," he said simply, then turned back to Mrs. Wilson. "I left that shirt I mentioned on my bed. It's the sleeve that needs mending if Miss Turner finds time today." "I'll see to it," Tabitha promised, returning her attention to the bread dough. Logan finished his coffee quickly after that, thanking them both before heading out into the early morning light. Through the window, Tabitha watched him mount the chestnut stallion with an easy grace that spoke of a lifetime in the saddle. The horse pranced sideways, eager to be moving, but Logan controlled it with subtle movements of his hands and legs. "Fine figure of a man," Mrs. Wilson observed, following Tabitha's gaze. "And he seems to have taken notice of you." "Don't be ridiculous," Tabitha said more sharply than she intended. "He's just being polite." Mrs. Wilson looked unconvinced but didn't press the issue. "Well, when you're done with that bread, you can see to his shirt, and maybe you could wear your green dress tomorrow. It brings out the color in your eyes." Tabitha chose not to respond to the suggestion. She'd learned long ago not to nurture false hopes. Men like Logan Quinn didn't court plain, penniless seamstresses. Eventually, he would reveal himself to be like all the others, looking right through her to the prettier, more vivacious women that Silver Creek had to offer. Later that morning, Tabitha made her way to Logan's room to collect the shirt. The corner bedroom was the largest in the boarding house, with windows facing both east and south. It was simply furnished with a bed, washstand, and chest of drawers, but Logan had already left his mark on the space. A worn saddle was propped in one corner, a rifle stood beside it, and a leather-bound book lay open on the bedside table. His shirt was spread neatly across the bed, a good-quality garment, despite its worn condition. Tabitha examined the tear in the right sleeve, noting that it would be a simple repair. As she picked up the shirt, she caught a faint scent of tobacco and pine soap. Something so ordinary shouldn't have affected her, yet she found herself holding the fabric a moment longer than necessary before folding it over her arm. The book on the table caught her eye, not a Bible as might be expected, but a volume of poetry. Curiosity overcame propriety, and she tilted her head to read the title, "Leaves of Grass" by Walt Whitman. She'd never read it herself, but had heard it mentioned as controversial in some circles. The fact that Logan Quinn carried poetry with him on cattle drives was unexpected, to say the least. Realizing she'd lingered too long, Tabitha hurried from the room with the shirt. She spent the afternoon working on the curtains and mending the tear in Logan's sleeve with neat, almost invisible stitches. As she worked, she found herself wondering about the man who wore a cattleman who read poetry and defended serving girls at dinner tables. Logan didn't return to the boarding house until after dark. Tabitha heard his arrival from her room, the sound of boots on the porch, followed by his voice exchanging pleasantries with the other boarders in the parlor. She had already delivered his mended shirt to his room and was now working by lamplight on a dress for Mrs. Calloway, the banker's wife, who was one of her few paying clients outside the boarding house. A soft knock at her door startled her. Setting aside her sewing, she rose to answer it, expecting to find Mrs. Wilson with some last-minute request. Instead, Logan Quinn stood in the hallway, his tall frame seeming to fill the narrow space. He held his mended shirt in one hand. "Miss Turner," he said, doffing his hat with the other hand, "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," she managed, though she was acutely aware of her simple dress and the loose tendril of hair that had escaped her bun hours ago. "Did the mending not meet your expectations?" "On the contrary," he said, holding up the shirt. "I can barely find where the tear was. I wanted to thank you properly and to pay you for your work, of course." He reached into his pocket and produced a silver dollar. Tabitha shook her head. "That's not necessary, Mr. Quinn. Mending for the boarders is part of my duties. Nevertheless, I insist." He held out the coin. "I know the value of skilled work, Miss Turner." Something in his tone respect perhaps made it impossible to refuse. Tabitha accepted the coin with a small nod. Thank you." An awkward silence fell between them. Logan shifted his weight, and Tabitha realized with a start that he seemed almost nervous. The notion was so absurd that she nearly laughed aloud. "Was there something else, Mr. Quinn?" she prompted when the silence stretched too long. "Yes, actually." He cleared his throat. "I was wondering if you might accompany me to church on Sunday. That is, if you attend services." Tabitha stared at him, certain she had misheard. Yes, I do attend services. But then may I escort you?" He met her eyes directly, his expression earnest. "I'm new in town and don't know many people. It would be a kindness." A kindness. Of course that was it. He was being charitable toward the plain spinster who mended his clothes. The realization stung more than it should have. "That's very considerate of you, Mr. Quinn," she said carefully. "But I wouldn't want to impose on your time. I'm sure there are many in town who would be eager to make your acquaintance." "I'm asking to accompany you, Miss Turner," he said, a note of stubbornness entering his voice. "Not anyone else in town." Before Tabitha could formulate a response, Mrs. Wilson appeared at the end of the hallway. "Oh, Mr. Quinn, I didn't realize you were back. Will you be wanting supper? We've kept a plate warm." Logan turned, hat still in hand. "That would be most welcome, Mrs. Wilson. Thank you." He glanced back at Tabitha. "Think on my request, Miss Turner. Good evening to you." With that, he followed Mrs. Wilson toward the kitchen, leaving Tabitha standing in her doorway, the silver dollar warm in her palm and confusion swirling in her mind. Sunday dawned bright and clear, with a crispness to the air that hinted at the coming winter. Tabitha had spent the intervening days in a state of uncertainty, alternating between anticipation and dread. She had ultimately accepted Logan's invitation, though she still couldn't fathom his motivation. Now, as she dressed for church, she second-guessed her decision with every button fastened. She had indeed chosen to wear her green dress not because of Mrs. Wilson's suggestion, she told herself firmly, but because it was her newest and most suitable for church. The color was a deep forest green that complemented her brown hair and hazel eyes. The cut was modest but not matronly, with a fitted bodice and a skirt that fell in simple lines to her ankles. As a concession to vanity or perhaps to the occasion, she left a few soft tendrils of hair framing her face rather than securing every strand in her usual severe bun. She owned no jewelry save a cameo brooch that had belonged to her mother, which she pinned at her throat. Mrs. Wilson appeared in her doorway just as Tabitha was donning her best bonnet. "My, don't you look lovely," the older woman said with evident approval. "I haven't seen you wear that brooch before." "It was my mother's," Tabitha explained, adjusting the angle of her bonnet. "I don't often have occasion to wear it." "Well, you should. It suits you." Mrs. Wilson smiled knowingly. "Mr. Quinn is waiting in the parlor, looking quite handsome himself, I might add." Tabitha drew a deep breath, fighting against both nerves and the treacherous hope that kept trying to take root in her heart. "Thank you for your help this week, Mrs. Wilson. I know taking on the extra mending was an imposition." "Nonsense, child. It's good to see you getting out." "You work too hard." The landlady patted her arm. "Now don't keep that man waiting any longer." Tabitha made her way to the parlor, each step measured and deliberate. She found Logan standing by the window, hat in hand, dressed in a dark suit that must have been brushed within an inch of its life. His boots were polished to a high shine, and his hair was neatly combed, though one rebellious curl fell across his forehead. He turned at her entrance, and the smile that spread across his face sent a flutter through Tabitha's stomach that she couldn't dismiss as mere nerves. "Miss Turner," he said, his voice warm, "you look beautiful this morning." The compliment was so unexpected that Tabitha had no ready response. "Thank you," she finally managed. "You look very nice as well, Mr. Quinn." "Logan, please," he said, offering his arm. We're going to be sitting next to each other in the house of the Lord. I think we can dispense with some formality." After a moment's hesitation, Tabitha placed her hand on his arm. "Then you must call me Tabitha." "Tabitha," he repeated, as if testing the sound of it. "It suits you." Biblical name, patient and faithful. "My father was a great believer in meaningful names," she said as they stepped out onto the porch, "though I've often wondered if he wasn't being overly optimistic in my case." Logan laughed, a rich, pleasant sound. "I doubt that very much. Shall we walk? It's not far to the church, and it's a fine morning." The church was indeed just a few blocks away, a simple white structure with a modest steeple, built 5 years earlier when Silver Creek had grown large enough to support a permanent minister. As they approached, Tabitha became acutely aware of the stares directed their way. Logan Quinn, with his fine horse and Texas drawl, had already become a subject of interest in town. Seeing him escorting Tabitha Turner to church was certain to set tongues wagging for weeks. "People are staring," she murmured, fighting the urge to withdraw her hand from his arm. Logan glanced around, seemingly unconcerned. "Let them. I've never much cared for others' opinions." "That's a luxury some of us can't afford," Tabitha replied before she could stop herself. He looked down at her then, his expression sobering. "Has it been very difficult for you here?" The question was asked with such genuine concern that Tabitha found herself answering honestly. "Not difficult exactly, just lonely at times. Silver Creek is still a small town. Everyone knows everyone's business and judgments are made quickly. And they've judged you lacking somehow." His tone held a hint of anger. "They've judged me plain," she said simply. "In a place where marriageable women are scarce, I've remained unwed. People notice such things." Logan's jaw tightened. "People can be damned fools." "Mr. Quinn," Tabitha scolded, though she couldn't entirely suppress a smile at his vehemence. "We're about to enter a church." His expression softened. "My apologies, but my point stands, however poorly expressed." They had reached the church steps. Several people had already entered, but others lingered outside, exchanging greetings and weekly gossip. Conversation faltered as Tabitha and Logan approached, only to resume with greater intensity once they'd passed. "Miss Turner, what a surprise to see you with company." The voice belonged to Eliza Carruthers, the banker's daughter and arguably the most beautiful young woman in Silver Creek. At 20, with golden hair and a figure that drew appreciative glances from every unmarried man in town, Eliza was accustomed to being the center of attention. "Good morning, Miss Carruthers," Tabitha replied evenly. "May I present Mr. Logan Quinn? Mr. Quinn, this is Miss Eliza Carruthers." Logan tipped his hat politely. "Miss Carruthers." Eliza's smile was dazzling. "Mr. Quinn, we've heard so much about you. A Texas cattleman, is it not? How thrilling. You must tell me all about your adventures out on the range." She placed a gloved hand on his arm, directly above where Tabitha's hand rested. Tabitha began to withdraw, certain that Logan would prefer the company of someone like Eliza. To her shock, he placed his free hand over hers, keeping it firmly in place on his arm. "Perhaps another time, Miss Carruthers," he said cordially but firmly. "I've promised this morning to Miss Turner." Eliza's perfect features registered surprise before smoothing into a practiced smile. "How lovely. Another time, then." She floated away toward a group of young men who were openly staring at her. "Shall we?" Logan asked, guiding Tabitha up the steps and into the church. The service passed in a blur for Tabitha. She was hyper-aware of Logan beside her in the pew, his tall frame making the space seem smaller somehow. He sang the hymns in a pleasant baritone, knew the prayers by heart, and listened attentively to Reverend Mitchell's sermon on the virtues of charity. Throughout it all, Tabitha felt the stares of the congregation burning into her back. When the service concluded, Logan insisted on introducing himself to the minister before escorting Tabitha back outside. The day had warmed considerably, and many of the churchgoers were lingering in the yard, reluctant to end their weekly social gathering. "Miss Turner, a word, if you please." Tabitha turned to find Mrs. Carruthers bearing down on them, her expression one of determined pleasantness. Beside her walked her husband, the banker, looking vaguely uncomfortable. "Good morning, Mrs. Carruthers, Mr. Carruthers," Tabitha greeted them, instinctively straightening her posture. "I've just been speaking with Reverend Mitchell about the Harvest Festival," Mrs. Carruthers said without preamble. "We're still in need of someone to coordinate the food preparations. I immediately thought of you, given your experience with the boarding house." It was a thinly veiled attempt to separate her from Logan, Tabitha realized. The Harvest Festival was still 3 weeks away, and Mrs. Carruthers had never sought her help with anything before. "I'm afraid I'll have to decline," Tabitha said, surprising herself with her own boldness. "My duties at Mrs. Wilson's keep me quite occupied." Mrs. Carruthers' smile tightened. "I see. How unfortunate." Her gaze shifted to Logan. "Mr. Quinn, we would be delighted if you would join us for Sunday dinner. As newcomers to our town, it's important that you meet the right sort of people." The implication was clear, and Tabitha felt a familiar shame begin to curl in her stomach. Before she could speak, however, Logan answered. "That's most kind of you, Mrs. Carruthers, but I've already accepted an invitation from Miss Turner to dine at the boarding house." He smiled down at Tabitha. "Isn't that right?" Tabitha stared at him in confusion before recovering her composure. "Yes, that's right." Mrs. Carruthers looked as if she'd bitten into something sour. "Well, another time, perhaps. Come, Harold." She swept away, her husband trailing in her wake. As soon as they were out of earshot, Tabitha turned to Logan. "I never invited you to dinner." "I know," he admitted, looking not the least bit repentant. "But you will now, won't you? To save me from being a liar in the eyes of the Lord on a Sunday." His expression was so hopeful, so boyishly charming that Tabitha couldn't help but laugh. "I suppose I must, if only to preserve your immortal soul." "Exactly my thinking." He offered his arm once more. "Shall we?" As they walked back toward the boarding house, Tabitha found herself relaxing into the strange, unexpected pleasure of Logan's company. He pointed out things she'd passed 100 times, but never truly noticed: a nest of swallows under the eaves of the Mercantile, the intricate woodwork on the new bank building, the first hints of autumn color in the cottonwoods along the creek. "You notice a great deal for someone who's only been in town a week," she observed. "My father taught me to pay attention to my surroundings," Logan replied. "Said a man who doesn't notice the details is likely to miss both danger and opportunity." Sound advice. He was a wise man in many ways, though he had his blind spots. Logan's expression grew thoughtful. "He never did understand my interest in books, for instance. Thought it a waste of time for a rancher." "Yet you carry poetry with you on your travels," Tabitha said before thinking better of it. Logan looked at her in surprise. "You saw my book when I collected your shirt for mending," she admitted, heat rising to her cheeks. "I apologize for the intrusion." "No need for apologies. I'm just surprised you recognized it. Whitman isn't exactly common reading for young ladies." "I haven't read it myself," Tabitha clarified, "but I've heard it mentioned. Do you find it very beautiful?" Logan considered the question seriously. "Beautiful, yes, but more than that. Honest. Whitman sees the world as it is with all its flaws and loves it anyway. That's a rare gift." They had reached the boarding house. Several of the other boarders were already returning from church, but Mrs. Wilson had left a cold dinner laid out in the dining room for anyone who wanted it. Logan held the door for Tabitha. his hand lightly touching the small of her back as she passed through a gentleman's gesture that nonetheless sent a shiver up her spine. The dining room was empty save for the elderly couple, who nodded politely before returning to their own quiet conversation. Logan pulled out a chair for Tabitha before taking the seat across from her. "I feel I should apologize," he said as they began to eat. "For what?" "For putting you in an awkward position with the Carruthers woman. It wasn't my intention to cause you discomfort." Tabitha shook her head. "You have nothing to apologize for. Mrs. Carruthers has always found me lacking. I'm accustomed to it." "You shouldn't have to be," Logan said with unexpected vehemence. "There's nothing lacking about you, Tabitha." The earnestness in his voice made her look up sharply. His gray eyes held hers, and there was something in them admiration, perhaps that made her breath catch. "You barely know me," she said softly. "I know enough." He leaned forward slightly. "I know you rise before dawn to grind coffee beans because it makes a better cup. I know your stitches are so fine they're nearly invisible. I know you keep poetry books from prying eyes but recognize their titles. And I know you're the first person in this town who's made me feel welcome without wanting something from me." Tabitha looked down at her plate, overwhelmed by his words and the intensity behind them. "People will talk, about you spending time with me. Let them. I told you I don't much care for others' opinions." "You say that now," Tabitha said, voicing the fear that had been growing since he first asked to escort her to church. "But Silver Creek is a small town with a long memory. If you intend to do business here, you might find that some doors close to you because of associations deemed unsuitable." Logan was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was low and serious. "Tabitha, look at me." She raised her eyes reluctantly. "I've spent my life doing what needs to be done, not what's easy or popular. I left home at 16 because my father and I couldn't agree on how to run the ranch. I built my own herd from scratch, drove cattle through Comanche territory when others wouldn't risk it, and crossed the Red River in flood season because I gave my word the beef would arrive on time." His jaw set in a determined line. "If anyone in this town thinks they can dictate who I associate with, they're welcome to try." The conviction in his voice was unmistakable. Tabitha found herself believing him, despite years of experience that taught her to expect disappointment. "Besides," he added, his expression softening into a smile, "I find I enjoy your company far more than that of Mrs. Carruthers or her kind." "A dubious compliment, Mr. Quinn," Tabitha replied, allowing herself to return his smile. "Logan," he corrected gently. "And it was meant most sincerely." The days that followed took on a pattern that was both exhilarating and terrifying for Tabitha. Logan continued to seek out her company whenever his business affairs allowed. He took breakfast in the kitchen rather than the dining room, chatting with her and Mrs. Wilson as they prepared the day's meals. In the evenings, he often invited Tabitha to join him for a walk through town, weather permitting, or to sit with him in the parlor, where he sometimes read aloud from his book of poetry. True to his word, Logan seemed utterly indifferent to the whispers that followed them, and whisper people did. Tabitha overheard snatches of conversation that fell silent when she approached speculation about what a man like Logan Quinn could possibly see in plain Tabitha Turner, wondering if he was simply amusing himself until a more suitable prospect appeared. She tried not to let these comments affect her, but old insecurities were not easily dismissed. Each time Logan smiled at her or sought her opinion on some matter, a part of her waited for the moment when his interest would wane. Yet days passed, and then weeks, and still he seemed genuinely pleased by her company. November arrived with a bitter cold snap that drove most people indoors. The boarding house became a cozy refuge against the weather, with a fire burning constantly in the parlor hearth. It was there, on a particularly frigid evening, that Tabitha found herself alone with Logan, working on embroidery while he read. "May I ask you something personal?" Logan said suddenly, closing his book. Tabitha looked up, needle poised mid-stitch. "I suppose so. How did you come to be in Silver Creek? You've mentioned your father, but never your family or where you're from originally." It was a reasonable question, but one Tabitha rarely had to answer. Most people in town knew her history or thought they did. "I came here with my father 4 years ago," she began, setting aside her embroidery. "He was a pharmacist by trade, but he had developed a cough that wouldn't heal. The doctor in Kansas City recommended a drier climate, so we headed west." She smoothed an imaginary wrinkle from her skirt. "We had planned to go all the way to California, but by the time we reached Silver Creek, he was too ill to continue. He died that first winter." "I'm sorry," Logan said, his voice gentle. "That must have been very difficult." Tabitha nodded. "It was. We had very little money left by then. I sold his medical books and equipment to pay for the funeral, and then—" She shrugged. "Mrs. Wilson needed help and I needed a place to stay. It worked out well enough. You never considered returning east. Surely you had family there." "My mother died when I was 14. There was an aunt in Philadelphia, but we'd lost touch after my father decided to move west." Tabitha picked up her embroidery again, finding comfort in the familiar activity. "Besides, I didn't have the means to travel back, even if I'd wanted to." Logan was quiet for a moment, watching her work. "You've made a life for yourself here despite the difficulties. That takes courage." "Not courage," Tabitha corrected. "Necessity. Sometimes they're the same thing." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "My mother died when I was young too. Fever took her when I was 8. My father never remarried, though half the widows in the county tried to catch his eye. You must have missed her terribly." "I did. Still do in some ways." His expression turned distant. "She used to sing to me every night before bed, had the sweetest voice you ever heard. My father forbade anyone from singing in the house after she was gone, said he couldn't bear it." "That seems a harsh way to preserve her memory," Tabitha said carefully. "My father was a harsh man in many ways." Logan straightened, his expression clearing. "But he taught me the cattle business from the ground up, and for that I'm grateful. Without those skills, I wouldn't have what I have now." "And what is that exactly?" Tabitha asked, curiosity getting the better of her. "You've spoken of your ranch, but not in detail." A smile touched Logan's lips. "The Double Q. Not the biggest spread in Texas, but respectable. 2,000 acres, most of it good grazing land. A creek running through the north section that doesn't dry up even in the worst droughts. Main house needs work. It was built before the war and hasn't had much attention since, but it's solid. Got about 800 head of cattle, mixed breed, which is why I'm looking to buy those Hereford bulls from Patterson. Need to improve the bloodline." "It sounds wonderful," Tabitha said sincerely. "It can be." His eyes held hers. "It's lonely, though. A ranch that size needs a family to make it a home." The implication in his words hung in the air between them. Tabitha's heart began to race, and she looked down at her embroidery, suddenly unable to meet his gaze. "I should check on Mrs. Wilson," she said, rising abruptly. "She mentioned a headache earlier." Logan stood as well, reaching out to catch her hand before she could flee. "Tabitha, wait. I've upset you. That wasn't my intention." "You haven't upset me," she lied, acutely aware of his warm fingers enclosing hers. "I'm just concerned about Mrs. Wilson." "Of course." He released her hand reluctantly. "Perhaps we could continue our conversation tomorrow. I'd like to tell you more about Texas. I think you might like it there." Tabitha managed a nod before hurrying from the room, her composure threatening to crumble with each step. She didn't go to Mrs. Wilson, who was, in fact, perfectly fine and likely already asleep, but instead retreated to her own small room, where she sank onto the edge of her bed, trembling. Logan's words echoed in her mind. A ranch that size needs a family to make it a home. Was he truly suggesting what she thought? Could he possibly be considering her as the woman to share that home with him? The very idea was both thrilling and terrifying. Tabitha had long ago resigned herself to spinsterhood, to a life of service rather than partnership. The possibility that a man like Logan, handsome, successful, kind, might see her as worthy of love seemed too fantastic to be real. He's just being friendly, she told herself firmly. Don't build castles in the air, Tabitha. You know better. But as she prepared for bed, she couldn't quite suppress the hope that had taken root in her heart, a dangerous, precious hope that perhaps, against all odds, Logan Quinn saw in her something that no one else ever had. The Harvest Festival arrived on a crisp Saturday in late November. The town square had been transformed overnight, with stalls selling everything from apple cider to hand-knitted scarves. Children darted between the legs of adults, playing games of tag and begging for pennies to buy candy. A small band played fiddle tunes near the hastily constructed dance floor, though it was still too early for dancing to begin. Tabitha stood at Mrs. Wilson's food stall, arranging pies and cakes on the tablecloth-covered surface. The older woman had insisted on contributing to the festival despite not being on the official planning committee, and Tabitha had spent the previous day helping to bake enough desserts to feed half the town. There you are. She looked up to find Logan striding toward her, looking more relaxed than she'd seen him in days. Since their conversation in the parlor, a strange tension had existed between them, not unpleasant, but weighted with unspoken words. Logan had been busy finalizing his deal with Patterson for the Hereford Bulls, and Tabitha had thrown herself into preparations for the festival, each seeming to need the distance to gather their thoughts. "Good morning," she greeted him, suddenly self-conscious in her best dress, the green one again, though she'd added a new lace collar that had taken 3 evenings to complete. "Morning," he replied, his eyes taking in the array of baked goods. "This is quite a spread." "Did you sleep at all last night?" "A few hours," Tabitha admitted. Mrs. Wilson was determined to outdo Mrs. Carruthers' contribution. Logan chuckled. "A worthy goal, I'm sure. Speaking of Mrs. Wilson, where is she? I thought she'd be manning this stall with you." "She went to fetch more napkins. We're expecting a rush once the dancing starts and people work up an appetite." As if on cue, the band struck up a livelier tune, and several couples moved toward the dance floor. "In that case," Logan said, extending his hand, "may I have this dance, Miss Turner?" Tabitha glanced anxiously at the unattended stall. "I shouldn't leave the pies." "Just one dance," Logan coaxed. "Mrs. Wilson will be back any minute, and I've been looking forward to this all week." His admission warmed her, chasing away her hesitation. "Very well, one dance." He led her to the edge of the dance floor, where other couples were already twirling to the music. Tabitha hadn't danced since her father was alive. He had taught her the basics when she was a girl, insisting that every young lady should know how to move gracefully. She prayed those lessons would come back to her now, as Logan's hand settled at her waist and the other clasped hers. "I should warn you," she said as they began to move, "I'm not very practiced at this." "You're doing fine," Logan assured her, guiding her through the first turn. "Just follow my lead." And somehow she did. After the initial awkwardness, Tabitha found herself relaxing into the dance, matching Logan's steps as if they'd done this 100 times before. He was a surprisingly graceful dancer for such a tall man, moving with the same easy confidence he showed on horseback. "Where did you learn to dance?" she asked as he spun her beneath his arm. "My mother insisted," he replied, drawing her back to him. Said no son of hers would grow up to be a clumsy ox at social gatherings. She had me practicing in the barn with a broomstick partner until I could do a proper waltz. The image made Tabitha laugh, a spontaneous, joyful sound that drew glances from nearby dancers. Logan's eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled down at her. "You should laugh more often," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "It suits you." Before Tabitha could respond, the music ended. Couples around them stopped dancing, applauding the band before either leaving the floor or repositioning for the next number. "Thank you for the dance," Tabitha said, beginning to withdraw her hand from his. Logan held firm. "The next one too, please." She hesitated, glancing toward the pie stall. Mrs. Wilson had returned and was watching them with undisguised delight, waving for Tabitha to continue dancing when their eyes met. "I suppose one more wouldn't hurt," Tabitha conceded, unable to resist the hope in Logan's expression. One dance became two, and then three, until Tabitha lost count. They paused only once for refreshments, Logan fetching them both cups of cider while Tabitha caught her breath. She was vaguely aware of the stares directed their way, of whispers behind hands and raised eyebrows, but for once, she found she didn't care. The joy of the moment of being held in Logan's arms, of moving in perfect harmony with him, overshadowed any concerns about town gossip. As the afternoon wore on, the crowd thinned somewhat as families with young children headed home for supper. The band took a brief rest, and Logan suggested they walk around the festival to see the other stalls. "I should check on Mrs. Wilson," Tabitha said, reluctant to end their time together but mindful of her responsibilities. "Of course." Logan offered his arm, which Tabitha took without hesitation. They made their way back to the food stall, where they found Mrs. Wilson chatting animatedly with Reverend Mitchell. "There you are, my dears," Mrs. Wilson exclaimed, beaming at them. "You two make such a handsome couple on the dance floor. Everyone was commenting on it." Tabitha felt herself blush. "We just came to see if you needed any help." "Not at all. The Reverend has been keeping me company and sales have been excellent. In fact," she added with a meaningful look, "I was just telling him I can manage on my own for the rest of the evening." "Are you sure?" Tabitha asked, though a part of her hoped desperately that Mrs. Wilson would insist. "Absolutely certain. You young people should enjoy the festival. It only comes once a year after all." Logan thanked Mrs. Wilson warmly before leading Tabitha away, his hand covering hers where it rested on his arm. "I think we've been given official permission to enjoy ourselves," he said, smiling down at her. "So it seems." Tabitha returned his smile, feeling lighter than she had in years. "What would you like to see next?" They wandered through the festival, stopping to admire handcrafted goods and watch children's games. Logan bought her a ribbon for her hair, a deep green that matched her dress, and insisted on tying it around her bun himself, his fingers gentle as they brushed against her neck. The simple gesture felt strangely intimate, and Tabitha found herself leaning slightly into his touch. As dusk fell, lanterns were lit throughout the square, casting a warm glow over the proceedings. The band returned, this time playing slower, more romantic tunes. Logan led Tabitha back to the dance floor without asking, and she went willingly, stepping into his arms as if it were the most natural thing in the world. They danced more closely now, the tempo of the music requiring even that they hold each other nearer. Tabitha could feel the steady beat of Logan's heart where her hand rested against his chest, could smell the clean scent of his shaving soap mixed with the wool of his suit. "Tabitha," he said softly, his breath warm against her hair. "There's something I need to tell you." She looked up at him, heart hammering in her chest. "Yes, I've finalized the purchase of Patterson's bulls. They'll be delivered to my ranch next month." "Oh," she tried to hide her disappointment. "That's wonderful news. I know how important that was to you." "It means I'll be leaving Silver Creek soon," he continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "I need to get home before the worst of the winter weather sets in." Tabitha nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in her throat. Of course he was leaving. She had always known he would. His life, his ranch, his future, all were in Texas, not in this small Wyoming town. "I'd like you to come with me," Logan said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "As my wife, if you'll have me." Tabitha stumbled, missing a step. Logan's arm tightened around her waist, keeping her upright as they came to a stop at the edge of the dance floor. "What did you say?" she whispered, certain she had misheard. Logan took a deep breath. "I'm asking you to marry me, Tabitha, to come to Texas as my wife." She stared at him, searching his face for any sign of mockery or pity, finding only earnest hope and something that looked remarkably like love. "But why?" The question escaped before she could stop it. "Why me? You could have any woman in any town. I'm not. I'm not beautiful or accomplished or—" "Stop." Logan placed a finger gently against her lips. "Don't say such things about the woman I love." Love. The word hung in the air between them, precious and terrifying. "You don't know me well enough to love me," Tabitha protested weakly. "I know everything I need to know." Logan took her hands in his expression solemn. "I know you're kind and intelligent. I know you work harder than anyone I've ever met. I know you find beauty in small things that others overlook. And I know that from the moment I saw you pouring coffee in Mrs. Wilson's kitchen, I couldn't get you out of my mind." Tabitha shook her head, overwhelmed. "People will say you've lost your senses. Let them. I know what I want, Tabitha, and it's you. It's been you from the start." His thumbs traced circles on the backs of her hands. "But if you don't feel the same, if you can't imagine a life with me in Texas, I'll understand. I won't press you." "It's not that," Tabitha said hastily. "I do have feelings for you, strong feelings, but everything is happening so quickly." "I know, and I wouldn't rush you if circumstances were different, but I need to leave within the week and the thought of going without you." He trailed off, swallowing hard. "I couldn't bear it." Around them, the festival continued, music playing, people laughing and talking, lanterns swaying in the gentle evening breeze. But for Tabitha, the world had narrowed to this moment, this man, this impossible choice. "I need time to think," she said finally. "Can you give me that at least?" "A day or two," relief flooded Logan's face. "Of course. Take all the time you need. Just know that whatever you decide, my feelings won't change. I love you, Tabitha Turner, and I want to spend my life proving it to you." He raised her hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles before releasing her. The gesture was so tender, so full of promise, that Tabitha felt tears spring to her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, not trusting herself to say more. They walked back to the boarding house in companionable silence, Logan's hand occasionally brushing against hers but not taking it, as if understanding her need for space. At the door, he bid her good night with a respectful bow, though his eyes conveyed everything his actions did not. Tabitha barely slept that night, her mind racing with possibilities. Marriage to Logan would mean leaving everything she knew, Mrs. Wilson, her few friends, the security of her established place in Silver Creek. It would mean traveling hundreds of miles to a land she'd never seen, to become the wife of a man she'd known for less than 2 months. By any rational measure, it was madness. And yet, And yet when she imagined herself in 5 years, in 10, still at the boarding house, still enduring the pitying glances and whispered comments, her heart contracted painfully. Logan offered not just marriage but partnership, respect, and what she truly believed was love. He really saw her in a way no one else ever had. Dawn found her at her window, watching the sky lighten from black to gray to pink. She had made her decision. Mrs. Wilson was already in the kitchen when Tabitha entered, her eyes knowing as she took in Tabitha's appearance. "You haven't slept," the older woman observed, passing her a cup of coffee. "Not much," Tabitha admitted, gratefully accepting the steaming cup. "He asked you to marry him, didn't he, at the festival?" Tabitha looked up in surprise. "How did you know?" Mrs. Wilson smiled. "My dear, that man has been looking at you like you hung the moon since the day he arrived. I'd have been more surprised if he hadn't asked." She patted Tabitha's hand. "And what did you tell him?" "That I needed time to think." "And have you thought about it?" Tabitha nodded, taking a fortifying sip of coffee. "I'm going to say yes." Mrs. Wilson clapped her hands together in delight. "Oh, my dear girl, I'm so happy for you both. When will the wedding be? Before he leaves for Texas, I assume." "If he still wants me," Tabitha said, a last shadow of doubt crossing her mind. "It was late when we talked. Perhaps in the light of day he'll reconsider." As if summoned by her words, the back door opened and Logan stepped into the kitchen. He was dressed for riding, his hat in his hands, and his expression turned from determination to joy when he saw Tabitha. "Good morning," he said, his voice carefully neutral despite the hope in his eyes. "I'll leave you two to talk," Mrs. Wilson said, not even trying to hide her smile as she bustled out of the kitchen. For a moment neither spoke. Then, simultaneously, "I've been thinking about last night." They both stopped, laughed awkwardly, and Logan gestured for Tabitha to continue. Drawing a deep breath, she said simply, "Yes." Logan's brow furrowed in confusion. "Yes, yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'll go to Texas with you. Yes to everything." The joy that transformed Logan's face was like sunrise breaking over mountains. In 2 quick strides, he crossed the kitchen and gathered Tabitha in his arms, lifting her off her feet in his exuberance. "You mean it?" he asked, setting her down but keeping his arms around her waist. "You'll really be my wife?" Tabitha nodded, her own happiness bubbling up inside her like a spring. "I will, though I think you're still getting the worse end of the bargain." "Nonsense," Logan said firmly. "I'm getting the best deal any man ever made." His expression sobered slightly. "But are you sure, Tabitha? Really sure? Texas is a long way from here and ranch life isn't easy." "I'm sure," she said, surprising herself with her conviction. "I want to be with you, Logan, wherever that takes us." His smile returned, brighter than before. "Then we'd better start making plans. I'd like to be married before we leave, if that suits you. No sense in traveling all that way without being husband and wife." "How soon were you thinking?" Tabitha asked, practical concerns beginning to assert themselves. "I'll need time to sew a dress and to make arrangements with Mrs. Wilson. Would 3 days be too soon?" Logan asked, his eagerness making him look younger. "That would give us enough time to have the banns read once on Sunday, get a special license from the judge, and be married by Tuesday. We could leave Wednesday morning." Tabitha's eyes widened. 3 days, that's hardly any time at all. Too soon." His expression fell slightly. "We could wait longer if you need more time. I just thought—" "No," Tabitha interrupted, surprising herself again. 3 days is perfect." And it was. Somehow, now that she had made her decision, Tabitha was eager to begin their life together. The prospect of becoming Mrs. Logan Quinn, of starting fresh in a new place where no one knew her as plain Tabitha Turner, was more appealing than she could have imagined. Logan's smile returned full force. "Perfect," he echoed. Then, with a glance toward the door to ensure they were still alone, he bent and pressed his lips to hers in a swift, gentle kiss there first. It was over almost before Tabitha realized it had begun, but the warmth of his mouth against hers lingered, sending a pleasant shiver through her body. "I've been wanting to do that since the day I met you," Logan confessed, his voice husky. "I'm glad you waited until I agreed to marry you," Tabitha replied, trying to sound stern despite the smile tugging at her lips. Logan laughed, the sound rich and joyful. "Always the proper lady. One of the many things I love about you." He reluctantly released her, stepping back. "I should go tell Reverend Mitchell our news so he can announce it on Sunday. And then, I need to arrange for the special license with Judge Watkins. And I should tell Mrs. Wilson officially, though I suspect she already knows," Tabitha said, glancing toward the door where the landlady had disappeared. "Meet me for lunch," Logan suggested, already backing toward the door as if reluctant to take his eyes off her. "We can discuss the details then." "I'll be here," Tabitha promised. With a final beaming smile, Logan donned his hat and departed, his footsteps quick and eager on the back porch. Tabitha stood in the middle of the kitchen, her fingertips touching her lips where he had kissed her, hardly able to believe the turn her life had taken. Mrs. Wilson reappeared almost immediately, confirming Tabitha's suspicion that she had been listening just outside the door. "Well," the older woman prompted, though her knowing smile suggested she had heard everything. "We're to be married on Tuesday," Tabitha said, the words still feeling strange on her tongue. "If that's not too inconvenient for you." Mrs. Wilson enveloped her in a warm embrace. "My dear girl, nothing could make me happier, though I'll miss you terribly, of course." "And I'll miss you," Tabitha said, returning the hug. "You've been so kind to me these past years." "Nonsense. You've earned every bit of your keep and more." Mrs. Wilson held her at arm's length, her expression suddenly serious. "Now about your trousseau. We have much to do and very little time. I have my mother's wedding dress in a trunk upstairs. It might need some alterations, but with your skill with a needle that shouldn't be a problem." Tabitha blinked back unexpected tears. "You'd lend me your mother's dress," not lend, give. "I have no daughter to pass it to, and I can think of no one I'd rather have wear it." Mrs. Wilson patted her cheek affectionately. "Now enough sentiment, we have a wedding to prepare for." The next 3 days passed in a whirlwind of activity. The news of Tabitha's engagement to Logan spread through Silver Creek like wildfire, eliciting reactions that ranged from genuine congratulations to barely concealed shock, and in some cases, resentment. Eliza Carruthers was reportedly furious, having set her sights on the handsome Texan despite his obvious lack of interest. Tabitha found she had little time to worry about town gossip. Between altering Mrs. Wilson's mother's wedding dress, a beautiful ivory silk with delicate lace trim, packing her few possessions, and making arrangements for the journey to Texas, every moment was filled with purposeful activity. Logan was equally busy, purchasing a wagon and supplies for the trip, finalizing his business affairs in town, and sending telegrams to his ranch foreman to expect their arrival. They met for meals and in the evenings, snatching moments together amid the preparations. Logan was attentive and thoughtful, bringing Tabitha small gifts, a warm shawl for the journey, a leather-bound journal for recording their travels, a silver thimble to replace her worn brass one. Each present was practical yet personal, chosen with care and presented with a tenderness that made Tabitha's heart swell. On Sunday, Reverend Mitchell announced their engagement to the congregation. Tabitha, seated beside Logan in the front pew, at his insistence, felt the weight of every stare as the minister asked if anyone knew of any impediment to the marriage. The silence that followed was profound, though she imagined she could hear the collective thoughts of the townspeople. What does he see in her? Logan seemed to sense her discomfort. He took her hand in his, squeezing gently, his thumb brushing over her knuckles in a reassuring caress. The simple gesture steadied her, reminding her that his opinion was the only one that mattered. After the service, they endured a gauntlet of well-wishers, some sincere, others clearly curious about the unlikely match. Logan handled each interaction with grace and humor, never releasing Tabitha's hand, making it clear to everyone that he was not only content with his choice but proud of it. Monday brought a fresh round of preparations and an unexpected complication: snow. It began falling shortly after dawn, light at first but steadily increasing until by midday, the streets were covered in a thick white blanket. "This could delay our departure," Logan said as they watched the snowfall from the boarding house parlor window. "The roads will be difficult if it continues." "Perhaps it's a sign we should wait," Tabitha suggested, though the thought of postponing their journey filled her with an odd sense of dread, as if delay might somehow change Logan's mind. He turned to her, reading her expression with uncanny accuracy. "Nothing will change my plans to marry you tomorrow, Tabitha. If we need to stay in Silver Creek a few extra days before starting for Texas, so be it. But you'll be my wife, snow or shine." His certainty warmed her more than the fire blazing in the hearth. "Then I'll pray for clear skies on Wednesday," she said, leaning slightly against his shoulder. Logan's arm encircled her waist, drawing her closer to his side. Such gestures of affection still felt new and thrilling to Tabitha, who had gone so long without physical touch of any kind. She allowed herself to relax into his embrace, savoring the solid strength of him. "I've been thinking," Logan said after a comfortable silence. "We should be married here in the parlor rather than the church. With the snow, it would be easier for Mrs. Wilson and the other boarders, and honestly, I'd prefer a smaller, more intimate ceremony anyway. Here." Tabitha glanced around the familiar room, trying to envision it transformed for a wedding. "Unless you have your heart set on the church," she shook her head. "No, I like the idea. It feels right somehow. This house has been my home for 4 years. It seems fitting to begin our new life together from this place." Logan pressed a kiss to her temple, his lips lingering against her skin. "Then it's settled. I'll speak to Reverend Mitchell today." Tuesday dawned clear and cold, the snow having stopped sometime in the night. Sunlight sparkled on the pristine white covering, turning Silver Creek into a scene from a Christmas card. Tabitha stood at her window, watching the town come to life, hardly able to believe that by sunset, she would be a married woman. Mrs. Wilson had insisted Tabitha stay in her room until the ceremony, declaring it bad luck for the groom to see the bride beforehand. Logan had laughed but agreed to the superstition, gallantly kissing Tabitha's hand before retiring to his own room the previous evening. Now, as midday approached, Mrs. Wilson helped Tabitha into the wedding dress, which had been transformed by Tabitha's skilled needle into a garment that fit her perfectly. The ivory silk complemented her complexion, and the modest cut, with its high collar and long sleeves, suited her natural reserve while still managing to enhance her figure. "You look beautiful, my dear," Mrs. Wilson said, blinking back tears as she pinned a small bunch of dried lavender and ribbons into Tabitha's hair. "Absolutely beautiful." Tabitha studied her reflection in the small mirror, hardly recognizing the woman who looked back at her. For the first time, she wore her hair down, the brown waves falling past her shoulders in a style that Mrs. Wilson had insisted was both fashionable and flattering. The dress, simple yet elegant, made her appear taller, more graceful. And there was something in her eyes, a brightness, a confidence that had never been there before. "Thank you," she said softly, turning to embrace the older woman. "For everything." "None of that now," Mrs. Wilson sniffed, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "You'll have me crying before the ceremony even begins, and that won't do at all." A knock at the door announced the arrival of Reverend Mitchell, who would escort Tabitha downstairs in lieu of her father. "It's time, my dear," he said when Mrs. Wilson opened the door. "Your groom is waiting, and if I may say so, he's the most nervous bridegroom I've seen in 30 years of ministry." Tabitha smiled at the thought of confident, capable Logan being nervous about anything. Then we shouldn't keep him waiting any longer. The parlor had been transformed under Mrs. Wilson's direction. The furniture had been rearranged to create a small aisle leading to the fireplace, where Logan stood with his back to the flames. Fresh pine boughs decorated the mantel, filling the room with their crisp scent, and someone had scattered winter berries among the greenery, adding spots of bright red to the arrangement. The other boarders stood as witnesses, along with a few of Mrs. Wilson's friends from town who had braved the snow to attend. But Tabitha barely noticed them. Her attention was fixed entirely on Logan, who had turned at her entrance and now stood watching her approach with an expression of such wonder and love that it took her breath away. He was dressed in a new suit of charcoal gray, his hair neatly combed, his face freshly shaved. He looked, Tabitha thought, like everything she had ever wanted without knowing she wanted it. Reverend Mitchell led her to Logan's side, placing her hand in his with a smile of genuine pleasure. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice carrying easily in the small room. "We are gathered here today in the sight of God to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The ceremony was brief but beautiful. Tabitha and Logan had chosen traditional vows, spoken clearly and with conviction. When Logan placed a simple gold band on her finger purchased, he told her, from his first cattle sale as a boy of 17 and carried ever since for the right woman, tears sprang to Tabitha's eyes. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Mitchell declared. "Mr. Quinn, you may kiss your bride." Logan cupped Tabitha's face in his hands with infinite tenderness, his eyes searching hers for a moment before he lowered his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle at first, then deepened slightly, a promise of things to come that made Tabitha's heart race. When they parted, the small gathering burst into applause, led by an enthusiastic Mrs. Wilson. What followed was a simple but joyful celebration. Mrs. Wilson had prepared a wedding feast that would have done credit to a much larger occasion, and someone had brought a fiddle, which soon had people clearing space for dancing. Logan and Tabitha shared the first dance as husband and wife, moving together with the easy harmony they had discovered at the Harvest Festival. "Happy, Mrs. Quinn," Logan murmured as they swayed to the music. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Tabitha replied truthfully, still marveling at her new name and status. "And you, any regrets?" "Only that I didn't find you sooner." He drew her closer, propriety allowing for greater intimacy now that they were wed. "But we have a lifetime ahead of us to make up for lost time." The celebration continued into the evening, with toasts and stories and more dancing. As darkness fell, Mrs. Wilson approached the newlyweds with a conspiratorial smile. "I've had your things moved to the blue room at the end of the hall," she told them quietly. "It's the largest with the best view, and I've had a fire lit and turned down the bed. No one will disturb you there." Tabitha felt heat rise to her cheeks at the older woman's knowing look, but Logan thanked her with perfect composure. "You've been more than kind, Mrs. Wilson. We're both in your debt." "Nonsense. Seeing Tabitha so happy is payment enough." She patted Tabitha's arm affectionately. Now, I think it's time you two slipped away. The party can continue without the guests of honor." Taking her advice, Logan made their excuses to the remaining guests, and amid good-natured teasing and calls of congratulation, led Tabitha up the stairs to their room for the night. The blue room was indeed the finest in the house, with a large four-poster bed, a washstand with an actual mirror, and a small sitting area near the fire. Someone, Mrs. Wilson, Tabitha guessed, had placed a vase of winter greenery on the bedside table and laid out fresh towels by the washbasin. As the door closed behind them, a sudden shyness overtook Tabitha. This was her husband now, this tall, handsome man who looked at her with such warmth in his eyes. They would share this room, this bed, this night together. "Tabitha," Logan said softly, sensing her nervousness. "We don't have to, that is, if you're tired from the day's events, we could simply rest." His consideration touched her deeply. "It's not that," she assured him, moving to stand before him. "It's just, all so new, but I'm not afraid, not with you." Logan's expression softened. He reached out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "We have all the time in the world. There's no rush." But as his eyes held hers, Tabitha felt a surge of courage. Rising on tiptoe, she pressed her lips to his in a kiss that surprised them both with its boldness. Logan responded immediately, his arms encircling her waist, drawing her against him as the kiss deepened into something more passionate than either had allowed themselves before. When they finally parted, both were breathing quickly. Logan rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if savoring the moment. "I love you, Tabitha Quinn," he whispered, "more than I have words to express." "Show me," she whispered back, her voice steadier than she felt. And he did, with gentle hands and tender words, guiding her through the mysteries of marriage with a patience and care that banished any lingering fears. In his arms, Tabitha discovered a joy she had never imagined possible, a connection so profound it seemed to transcend the physical and touch something deeper, more essential. Afterward, lying in the circle of his arms with her head pillowed on his chest, Tabitha listened to the steady beat of his heart and marveled at the turn her life had taken. 2 months ago, she had been plain Tabitha Turner, the spinster seamstress of Silver Creek, resigned to a life of loneliness and quiet desperation. Now she was Mrs. Logan Quinn, beloved wife, about to embark on a new life in a new land with the man who had seen beauty in her when no one else had. "What are you thinking?" Logan asked, his fingers tracing idle patterns on her bare shoulder. "That I never expected to be this happy," Tabitha admitted. "That I'm still half afraid I'll wake up and find this was all a dream." Logan's arms tightened around her. "Not a dream. And if it is, then I'm dreaming too, and I never want to wake up." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Sleep now, my love. We have a long journey ahead and a lifetime of happiness to pursue." Secure in his embrace, Tabitha closed her eyes, allowing sleep to claim her. Her last conscious thought was a prayer of gratitude for the man who had looked past the surface, to see the woman beneath the man who had called her beautiful, when everyone else had called her plain. The journey to Texas was long and often arduous, taking them through snowstorms and across swollen rivers, through territories still wild and sparsely settled. But through it all, Tabitha never once regretted her decision. Each hardship faced together only strengthened the bond between her and Logan, each challenge overcome a testament to their partnership. And when, 6 weeks after leaving Silver Creek, they crested a hill to see the double queue spread out before them, the sturdy main house nestled against a stand of oak trees, cattle dotting the winter-brown pastures, a creek winding silver through the property, Tabitha knew she had truly come home. "What do you think?" Logan asked, reining in his horse beside the wagon where Tabitha sat. Is it what you imagined? Tabitha looked out over the land that would now be hers to help manage, to improve, to love as Logan did. It's more, she said simply. So much more. Logan reached across to take her hand, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled, that same smile that had first captured her heart in Mrs. Wilson's kitchen all those months ago. "Welcome home, Mrs. Quinn," he said. "The beauty I've waited for all my life." And as they drove down toward the ranch house, toward their future together, Tabitha knew that she had found not just a husband, but a place where she truly belonged, a place where she was seen, valued, and loved, not despite her plainness, but because of the beauty that Logan had recognized from the very beginning. In the years that followed, the double Q flourished under their joint care. The Hereford bulls improved the herd as Logan had predicted, and Tabitha's practical management of the household finances allowed them to expand their holdings. Children came first, a daughter with Logan's gray eyes and Tabitha's quick mind. Then twin boys who inherited their father's height and their mother's steadfast nature. Letters arrived regularly from Mrs. Wilson, who delighted in hearing of their progress and who visited once, traveling the long distance despite her advancing years, to meet her grandchildren, as she called them. News from Silver Creek grew less important as time passed. Though Tabitha occasionally heard snippets, Eliza Carruthers had married a banker from Denver. The railroad had finally come through, bringing new prosperity and people to the town. But these were distant concerns now. Tabitha's world was here, on the rolling Texas plains, with the man who had seen in her what no one else had bothered to look for. And if, occasionally, she caught sight of herself in the mirror and still saw traces of the plain girl she had once been, Logan was always there to remind her of the truth he had known from the beginning. "The most beautiful woman in Texas," he would say, coming up behind her to wrap his arms around her waist, pressing a kiss to the side of her neck. "The beauty I waited for all my life." And in his eyes, in his touch, in the life they had built together, Tabitha knew it was true.